So, continuing about the left, I want to talk about cultural Marxism. And this is a term I've heard bandied about by people on the right. And I want to read something from the New York Times, and I'll post a link to this on the website. But this is, the title is "The Alt-Right's Favorite Meme is 100 Years Old," and then the subtitle: "Cultural Marxism might sound postmodern, but it's got a long, toxic history." And then this is the picture that they show. So you don't know this guy's face, perhaps, but it's the guy the Norwegian guy who shot and killed 77 kids at a leftist camp. And first thing, I think the term cultural Marxism is not a good term, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But I feel like the term alt-right is also not a good term. What does that mean? How do you define that? This guy talks about cultural Marxism, and I went and looked up cultural Marxism, and he talks about, and this is the one place that I thought maybe I had heard it. He says that Jordan Peterson, the self-help guru and best-selling author, has railed against it in his YouTube ruminations. Oh, I have to read this sentence. Originally an American contribution to the phantasmagoria of the alt-right, the fear of cultural Marxism has been percolating for years through the global sewers of hatred. And Jordan Peterson, and then he goes on and talks about, so it's a difficult story, and I don't know the answer to this story, so you have to know a little bit about do you like my shirt, by the way? My students made it for me. My AP students is me as Che Guevara. That wonderful person on the left. I'm joking, of course. He's an evil man, as is Castro. But I kind of like it nonetheless. Cultural Marxism. So here's what I think cultural Marxism is. I think it's postmodernism. In fact, that's the joke I think the person says. Cultural Marxism might sound postmodern, but it's got a long toxic history, which, by the way, so there's a group of folk called the Frankfurter School, and they're German intellects who also happen to be Jewish, and it's their talk about how modernity is no longer available to us, and we have to go post-modern. I don't know enough about this to even throw out names, so I'm not going to throw out any names. But Alan Bloom is talking about that thing in the 1987 book, Closing of the American Mind. And then right after that's written, in the 1990s and 2000, we see this blossoming of critical studies of African-American studies, of queer studies, of women's studies. And it's this that they're talking about when they talk about cultural Marxism. Now, this writer tries to make it sound like it's anti-Jewish, which this guy does use the term, but what can we find some stuff that the Unabomber said? Is everything the Unabomber said leading to death? And again, the fact that Alan Bloom, who's also Jewish, was talking about this a long time ago, makes me feel that this whole idea of trying to paint it as some kind of anti-Semitic thing is silly. Not, by the way, let me say, the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was anti-communist. And I do not doubt that they connected communism to Judaism, and because they were anti-Semitic and anti-Catholic at the same time. But that doesn't mean that communism isn't real. That Emma Goldstone, who tried, an anarchist who tried to murder someone, wasn't really a bad person, and that these anarchists weren't trying to take over America. They did not take over America, of course, as we know. They did take over Russia and became the Soviet Union and China. So, the intellectual, cultural Marxist, I believe, is what people mean by those people in those disciplines, those women's studies, African American studies, queer studies, all those studies that were just recently made fun of by a guy who, a group of people who wrote these fake articles and had them in the journals. I think a much better thing to do, and I wish someone would do this, and maybe they have already, to take the top, let's say, 25 articles, the most cited 25 articles from each discipline, and then go through those articles and find the top cited person. And let's see, who are all these people citing? If they're citing people from the Frankfurter School, then something's going on, I would say. Yes, it's true. And if they're not, they're not. I tend to think all disciplines are so rambunctious, and they all fight against each other. There's all sorts of groups of people. I don't think it's definitely not a conspiracy, but Jordan Peterson doesn't say it's a conspiracy either. He just says they've taken over the academy. And I don't know if that's true or not. I haven't read enough in the last 30 years. All my professors were pretty liberal, but they weren't cultural Marxist. They were Straussians, but of course I was taking political philosophy. So anyway, cultural Marxists, don't use that term. Why don't you try finding something more specific? And definitely don't say all Democrats are cultural Marxists, because they're not, for crying out loud. They're just normal Democrats. They're not all socialists, they're not all leftists, they're not all Marxists. Why don't we, just like, by the way, all Republicans are not fascists. If you think that all Democrats are communists, and then your opponents think that all Republicans are fascists, then all we have is the Spanish Civil War left. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's go to something new.